Hello, welcome to Lecture 8. Today we're going to be talking about self-presentation, which is more or less strategically putting your best foot forward. Question for you to think about as you think about this material today, and maybe discuss it with your classmates or friends, is what type of person is most likely to feel anxious and change her social behavior or his social behavior after discovering that she has some ketchup on her blouse or something else that makes her more noticeable. Explain your answer or think about how your answer is influenced by things such as self-presentational concerns and goals. Before we begin looking at the material today, let's do some announcements. First of all, and most importantly, we will have our test in 1 week, that is next Thursday. And that's indicated in your syllabus, which I hope you've read by now. Also, I hope that you're using the study guide that is available for download on the website. And don't forget that even if I haven't gone into a great deal of detail about everything on the slide, if it is in the text, it is potentially accessible on the exam. Also, that the study guide might include some things that aren't in the text, and if that's the case, then be looking for them either in descriptions in lecture or in the reserve reading. And I will point out that the reserve reading material is accessible. So here in the first exam period, we do have one reserve reading, and that is the Word at All study of self-fulfilling prophecy as demonstrated in 2 experiments. So be sure to look at that. In addition, a reminder that the references for your research paper, the social psychology intervention proposal paper, are due by Saturday just before midnight. And finally, if you are in the first in the news unit, that is if you have a last name early in the alphabet, be sure to remember that you have just 1 week left to put your in the news topic posting online. And remember, you're choosing from topics that are in the first test unit, in our text and reading, in the first test unit. Lots of options to choose from out there, so just be sure to get on that and don't forget it. There is a questionnaire that I'll email out to you. It's also on the Blackboard site in the course materials. You'll see a folder in there that says questionnaires and activities. It's the self-monitoring questionnaire, and you should take a moment to quickly fill that out. Don't think too much about it. Just fill it out, and then I'll encourage you to think about what it means in terms of whether it fits your social behavior or not. So what is self-presentation? We've been talking a lot about how the social context strongly influences us. But it's also important to remember that we try to influence the social world around us. And we also try to manage the impressions that others make of us. So sometimes you'll hear the term impression management, and that is more or less synonymous with self-presentation. The basic idea is that you try to make a good impression on others, and sometimes you might have a subtle difference there. You try to convey a desired impression rather than necessarily a good impression. For example, you might focus on certain things such as how competent you are, how attractive you are, or in some cases you might have a different kind of goal. For example, if you're playing poker, you might try to present to people that you're not very good at playing poker so that they might play in such a way that allows you to take advantage of them. Sometimes women may present themselves as being unattractive to someone who is they're trying to avoid in a social setting where somebody's hitting on them. So it is generally about making a good impression, but sometimes we have more specific goals in mind, and those are also self-presentation goals. So the definition of the text is the process by which we try to control the impressions people form of us. And there's two important goals in self-presentation. There are others, but two important ones are appearing likable and appearing competent. So what are some things that we focus our self-presentation tactics on? So just think for a moment, considering only your appearance, things that people can readily see without you engaging in any particular behavior. Think about the extent to which you might appear socially dominant, aggressive, how you might appear kind and understanding, attractive, intelligent, or conscientious. How are some of the things that you do, or some of the props, for lack of a better word, that you have, communicate these kinds of things? Think about some nonverbal behaviors. To be socially dominant, for example, maybe you sit at the head of the table. Maybe when you walk into a room, you stand tall and you speak loudly. Those are some socially dominant behaviors. When you're trying to self-present and you want people to think that you're kind and understanding, you make eye contact. You tilt your head to one side. You might change the tone of your voice in certain ways. If you're trying to look intelligent, you might wear glasses or have a well-organized notebook. Conscientious, you keep track of dates, you remember people's names. These are all kinds of different ways that we might communicate in a self-presentational way these kinds of themes. How do we go about self-presenting? We're already talking about that to some extent. You might think about some efforts that you take either on a daily basis or on certain occasions. Think of the ways that you might pay particular attention to your clothing. See if you're meeting someone important, like a potential employer or a person you're interested in dating. How are you concerned about clothing? What kinds of impressions are you trying to make with the clothing that you are selecting to wear? How you present your physical body. Are you in a relaxed pose? Or are you in a formal pose? You could also think about accessories in a way. Your car says something about you, and you choose a car if you have the ability to, partly as a way of making a certain impression. The type of phone you have. All of these kinds of things are things that you might consciously make an effort to select certain kinds of things to present certain sorts of images of yourself. And you may change it up depending upon the types of people that you're planning to interact with. And so as you think about that, try to be honest and thoughtful. Think about other ways that you might self-present. Think about people that you are particularly concerned about self-presenting to. Why do people self-present? Well, this is going back a fair bit, but one answer to that question comes from what we'll call the dramaturgical perspective. This actually comes out of sociology. These folks who got behind this perspective basically argues that much of social interaction can be thought of as a kind of like a drama or a play with actors and performances, setting scripts, props and roles and so forth. So I've selected a picture of William Shakespeare here because he said all the world is a stage. And social psychologists tend to agree with him in the extent that we think that we play certain roles that are expected of us. We sometimes interact and present ourselves and manipulate the social environment in a way to help us reach certain goals. So you might stage a performance, loosely speaking, for a potential employer or a potential dating partner. You might rehearse the kinds of things you plan to say to that person. Props might include clothing or a nice car that you've rented. We may engage these kinds of things when we think about certain roles that we play, a good employee role, a good brother role, a good sister or mother role. All of these things are sets of expectations based around a social understanding of what the appropriate behaviors are for a particular type of social role. So thinking more in terms of goals, when we answer the question, why do people self-present, we think about our desire to acquire certain desirable resources. We also think about our effort to help construct our self-images. By construct, we mean manipulate other people's impressions of us, influence other people's impressions of us, so that our self-image, as understood in that social way, is managed in part by our own efforts. And finally, we self-present to enable our social encounters to run more smoothly. So think about it. I'll give one example from my own experience. Every year, publishing representatives come to my office, and they want me to pick out the textbooks they have for sale for my courses so that lots of students will buy them, and they will get commissions on the textbooks that you buy. So they come to me and they self-present in a way to acquire desirable resources, getting that commission for themselves. So they try to be nice to me. They try to present themselves as similar and attractive. They try to present themselves as understanding my needs. And all of this is in an effort to acquire those desirable resources, the commissions that they will get if I select their textbook and you buy them. Think about similar experiences in your own life where a person self-presents to you, or you are self-presenting to a person to acquire some desirable resource. Maybe you're trying to get a favor from someone. Maybe you're trying to close a sale. Any number of things that you might self-present about. So here we shift our focus once again to think about, when do people self-present? What sorts of situations, what sort of occasions are likely to make people more likely to self-present or more focused on self-presentational concerns? So our first category of situations is when we think other people are paying attention to us. If there's something that causes us to feel like we're the focus of attention, then our self-presentational concerns are heightened because we think that people are attending to us and we want to make a good impression while they're focused on us. If we thought we were being ignored or no one was noticing us, then we would be less concerned about it. We also are very interested in self-presentation when other people that we self-present to can influence whether or not we reach our important goals. So, for example, if you were going to talk to your boss, your employer, and you had a goal of being promoted, even keeping your job, at that point you would be very interested in self-presenting in a way that made you appear competent to your employer, that made you appear likable to your employer. Those would be things that you would be very concerned about because your employer, he or she, could have an important influence on those goals that are important to you. And finally, we are often quite concerned about self-presentation when we think observers have impressions of us that are different than the ones that we desire. So in this last case, basically we encounter a social audience who may have what we believe is a mistaken impression or an undesirable impression of us. You know, a reputation, or someone's been spreading rumors. Something has caused these people to think differently about us than we want them to, and so we are then very keen to change that impression, and we engage in self-presentation in order to change their impression. So think of an example. You know, maybe someone's been spreading bad rumors about you, and you know who those bad rumors have gone to, and then when you encounter those people, you'll try to change up that impression in some way by self-presenting in a way that's counter to that bad rumor that's going around. So if they say that you're a really mean person, for example, you might be very interested in making the impression or creating, self-presenting the view that you're actually a kind and helpful person. Or maybe you went out on a first date with someone and things went really badly. You drank too much because you were nervous or something, and you don't want your new a potential dating partner to think that you're a lush or that you have a drinking problem or something. And so when you next have an opportunity, you will try to self-present in a way that shows you're in control and you're competent and you're not really into getting drunk, something like that. So think about when people self-present here. And here we're partly focused on situational kinds of concerns, but we're also focused on personality. So it's also kind of a who self-presents here. So public self-consciousness is a personality variable. So it's kind of a who. If we had on our slide here, we might have a little person icon on there. Public self-consciousness is this tendency to have a chronic awareness of oneself as being in the public eye or being noticed. So this public self-consciousness as a personality variable describes the difference between a person who always feels like other people are looking at them, thinking about them, noticing what he or she does. People are always monitoring my behavior. That would be similar to the idea of high public self-consciousness. On the other hand, a person who has very low public self-consciousness basically hardly notices that other people pay attention to them, are not concerned about other people noticing their behavior. In the first instance, high public self-consciousness, those people will be very concerned about self-presentation because they're concerned that other people are noticing them and what they're doing. On the other hand, people who are low on public self-consciousness are going to be relatively unconcerned about their behavior, or particularly how people will perceive their behavior. And this is similar to the concept of self-monitoring, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. A note here, as I started the slide here, I mentioned that you can also have a situational influence that makes you high in public self-consciousness. So if there's something that occurs to you when you're in a social setting that makes you feel like you're more noticeable or more in the spotlight, people are focused on you, that will create temporarily the state of public self-consciousness, which will influence your concerns about self-presentation. When something happens in the situation that makes you feel like you're in the spotlight, that people are noticing you, then you're going to be more concerned about self-presentational behavior and self-presentational goals. So let's look at an experiment that looks at this situation as opposed to personality differences in public self-consciousness. So this is referred to as the spotlight effect. Gilovich and her colleagues, his colleagues, asked Cornell students, psychology students like yourself, to sit in a room with 5 other subjects, participants that is, while wearing a Barry Manilow t-shirt. Now, when this research was done, Barry Manilow was a pop star of popular but of somewhat dubious cool factor. Some of my older students will recognize the name Barry Manilow, but for those of you who don't, it's kind of like you were wearing a Justin Bieber t-shirt. Like he's certainly a pop star, Justin Bieber, but he's kind of an embarrassing pop star, especially right now. So you're asked to sit in this room with 5 other people, and the experimenter had told you when you walked in, you have, as part of the experiment, you have to wear this t-shirt with Justin Bieber's face on the front of it. So on the next slide, what we see is the students who wore that t-shirt predicted that nearly half of the other people who were sitting with them would know or recall who was on the shirt. So basically what we're finding is those people wearing the Barry Manilow or Justin Bieber t-shirt, as it were, would feel as though other people in the group would notice the t-shirt, remember the t-shirt, and be knowledgeable about the t-shirt. So people are thinking, I've got this stupid t-shirt on, people are going to notice this, people are going to know who that embarrassing person is on my t-shirt, and they're going to remember that. So what we see in the first column there is the percentage of people predicted to remember the t-shirt. or another way to think of this is focused on the t-shirt or focused on the individual wearing the t-shirt. When we actually see the percentage of people who actually remembered what was on the t-shirt, it's considerably lower. So roughly half of the predicted amount actually did remember what was on the t-shirt. So what we're seeing is people were wearing this t-shirt. They were in a state of high public self-consciousness, meaning they felt like they were in the spotlight. People were going to notice this t-shirt they were wearing, and understandably they might be a little bit anxious or nervous, and that would drive their social or self-presentational behavior. Just to kind of underscore the point that this is an exaggerated state of public self-consciousness, they also had a third group of people view, I can't remember right now whether it was a videotape or a photo of the sitting where the 5 people were together and the one person had the t-shirt, and this control group was asked, how many people in this group do you think would have noticed the t-shirt? And as you can see, roughly the same amount as the actual prediction. So the person who's wearing the t-shirt has this biased view, this exaggeration that other people are noticing him, and when in reality most people aren't, are certainly far fewer, and that's verified by the control condition as well. Thinking back on your own experience, you've probably unintentionally had the spotlight effect occur to you. What you do see occasionally is you might spill some coffee on yourself in the morning and not have time to change your shirt or your blouse. You might rip your pants or your skirt or something like that as you're traveling to school and you don't have a chance to change your pants or clothes. And as you go about your day, you probably feel very self-conscious that people are noticing this coffee stain on your shirt or this small rip in your pants. And chances are that most people around you are of great concern to you. And that's similar to the graph we see here. So now we're turning our attention to a personality factor. This is self-monitoring. And this is basically the idea that some people have a strong tendency to be chronically concerned with their public image and to adjust their public behavior to fit the needs of the current situation. So there's 2 pieces to this self-monitoring concept that I want you to be aware of. First, a high self-monitor is a person who's chronically or habitually or consistently concerned with the public image that they are making. So they're kind of thinking about, how am I going to self-present? What's my self-presentational strategy going to be in this setting? And the other and critical important part here is that they continually adjust their behaviors to fit in with the needs of the current situation. Sometimes people in common language might refer to such a person as a social chameleon. They change their spots or change their stripes to fit in with the setting that they're in. A person who's low in self-monitoring, in contrast, does not vary their behavior a lot from situation to situation, is not particularly concerned with their self-presentation. They just behave in a way that is consistent with their own personal values. So let's look a little bit more closely at the characteristics of high and low self-monitors. High self-monitors are more inconsistent across situations. That is, they change as situations change. And they're also very good at assessing what other people want and to tailor their behavior to fit those wants and demands of the social setting. So, for example, a high self-monitor walking into a library and maybe he or she sees that people are being quiet and are whispering as they're doing their studying behavior, and they would self-present in a quiet, polite kind of way in that library situation. And then when they come into another situation, maybe at a cafeteria where people are being very loud and socializing in a boisterous way, he or she would change up their self-presentational strategy to kind of fit into that situation. Now, in contrast, low self-monitors, these are people who kind of look inside themselves, look at their self-concept, and decide on how to act based on what is kind of more normal or characteristic of themselves in terms of their self-concept. They do not look to the situation as much to guide their behavior, and thus they don't change as much across situations. So they tend to be more similar in their behavior, even though situations may be varying. So it kind of sounds like a high self-monitor is an insincere person. They're kind of always changing who they are to fit in. And to some extent that may be true, but it's also important to think about a high self-monitor as a person who's adaptable, and they manage to fit in well with and harmonize in many different situations. So there's kind of strengths and weaknesses of a high self-monitor. You could also think of a low self-monitor as a person who's true to him or herself, but you could also think of a low self-monitor as a person who's kind of inflexible and not responsive to the needs of others. So there's, pluses and minuses to both sides of this personality factor. So let's think some more about goals of self-presentation. In order to do that, I'd encourage you to think about a really embarrassing moment you've had. Think about that for a moment. Really embarrassing situation that you were in. You've really felt kind of ashamed or embarrassed. Okay, now that you've thought about that, think about the extent to which that embarrassment was linked to or associated with appearing unlikable, or appearing incompetent, or appearing vulnerable or weak. And then think about the social goals that are listed in your textbook on page 13. Some of those social goals, important to remember, it's a review and it'll be on the test. We have the desire to establish social ties. We have an attempt to attract and retain mates. We want to gain and maintain status. And we also defend ourselves against others who are trying to attack us, or defend people that we care about. And we also have a goal of understanding ourselves and others. Embarrassment is often the result of failing at one or more of these very fundamental social goals. So we feel embarrassed when we are losing status. We feel embarrassed when we are failing in our efforts to establish social ties. We feel embarrassed when we maybe are repelling a potential mate. We feel embarrassed when we're unable to defend ourselves. We're feeling weak. And we feel embarrassed into a variety of different things. But being vulnerable, being unlikable, these are concerns that often lead people to feel embarrassed. How does that link to self-presentational goals? Well, we often use self-presentation as a way of recovering from these embarrassing moments. We try to convince others that we are actually successful at these basic goals. We are attractive, we are competent, we are deserving of high status. So again, continuing on this idea of self-presentation and the goals it's associated with, let's focus in a moment here on the desire to appear as likable, the desire to be seen as competent, and a desire to be seen as powerful as opposed to weak. And as it's indicated there in the parenthetical statements, those are also associated with some more specific terms such as ingratiation, self-promotion, and intimidation. So if our goal is to appear likable, one strategy of self-presentation is to express liking for others. We like people who like us. So if you're trying to appear likable, then you give compliments to others, or you express liking for that other person that you're self-presenting to in other ways. So we can use verbal flattery, and we can also use nonverbal behaviors such as smiling, head nods, and mimicking the behavior of others. These are ways of expressing liking for others. Now you'll see that I put an asterisk by verbal flattery. That's partly because sometimes verbal flattery works in getting others to like us, but sometimes it also backfires. So why might it backfire? Verbal flattery is kind of a difficult or dangerous strategy because if you're very obvious with your verbal flattery, or if for some reason it appears to be insincere, or if the verbal flattery seems to have an ulterior motive, then we might doubt the sincerity of that compliment, and that would actually cause us to not like the person who's complimenting us. So it certainly is the case that more subtle forms of flattery, verbal flattery, such as indirectly expressing respect by asking for advice or expressing similar views to the person that you're trying to flatter, that tends to make people like us or ingratiate others to us. When we tend to doubt the sincerity of compliments, as I said before, it is the case that people may just say, "Oh, well, he's just trying to butter you up," or "Of course he would say that." He's trying to get good with me for some reason. Here is an example in research of using very subtle forms of behavior to get a person to feel liking for, to ingratiate that person to the other person. In this experiment, researchers primed half of the participants with the goal of being liked, and then they led half of the participants in each group, primed or not primed, to feel as though they had failed at achieving a recent affiliative or social goal. So keep in mind here, we're priming people, we're getting them thinking about the goal of being liked. That's half of them, and other people are not so primed. And also we have half of these participants have recently had kind of a failure or an embarrassing moment in terms of trying to be likable. The researchers then recorded the extent to which the participants in these 4 different conditions mimicked the other person's foot shaking behavior. So it sounds a little bit odd, but imagine you're sitting across from a person or sitting beside a person, and you've got your legs crossed, and the other person is kind of bobbing their leg or shaking their foot. And in a very subtle way, we sometimes copy each other's behavior, and that is sometimes linked to this goal of trying to be likable. So let's look at what the research showed. On the left-hand side, you see those people who were not primed, that is, they were not made aware of the goal of being liked. And those folks, whether they had recently had a failure, an embarrassing failure in their liking attempts, or a success, did not differ in the amount of time that they spent shaking their foot or copying the behavior, the nonverbal behavior of the other person. On the other hand, if we look over on the right-hand side, these are the people who are been primed to think about how do you get this other person to like you. You're going to be sitting with them for a moment, and you're going to try to get this person to like you. Those people who had recently had a failure at getting another person to like them really engaged in much more nonverbal, physical copying behavior. Basically, they move their foot and move their leg in a very similar way to the other person that they were sitting with that they were trying to get them to like. So what we have here is a effort at a nonverbal level to recover from that social failure by getting someone else to like you, and getting someone else to like you through this kind of nonverbal behavior. Both everyday people like you and I and clinicians, psychology therapists, will sometimes use this nonverbal mirroring behavior as a way of establishing rapport, as a way of establishing a liking bond between two people. Another way to self-presentational strategy for getting a person to like you is to create the impression of similarity. So opinion conformity, or expressing similarity in opinions, is an ingratiation or a self-presentational liking strategy. So how likely, this is another research example, how likely are you to change your opinions to agree with someone else? Would you be more likely to agree with someone in terms of their opinions if that certain someone was attractive? That is, if we're back to that social goal of attracting and retaining mates, are you going to change up your self-presentational behavior to get that person to like you more? So what we see on the next slide is a study by Mark Zanna and Susan Pack. It's conducted at Princeton University. So it's kind of in the middle of the women's first or second wave of feminism in the United States, so it's important to remember that. These are college women in that time period. And these women who participated in this research were experimentally manipulated to anticipate interacting with a man who was either highly desirable or not highly desirable. So they'd been shown some photographs of a guy who was quite attractive or a guy who was not so attractive. In addition, with the photograph was some differences in terms of how successful this college graduate or potential college graduate was likely to be in terms of their career trajectory. So the highly desirable guy was looking like he was on his way to a good career, high-paying career, and the less desirable guy was not doing as well in college and not as clearly on his path to a good career. So, in addition, these women were told that these highly desirable or not so highly desirable men had either traditional views of women, that is, believing the ideal woman should be passive and emotional and a homebody, or untraditional, non-traditional views of women, such as believing the ideal woman should be independent and ambitious. So we kind of have four different conditions here. Highly desirable guy who has a traditional view of women, highly desirable guy who has a non-traditional view of women, and then a not so desirable guy with either a traditional or non-traditional. Okay? So these women were then filling out questionnaires for the male student, this potential hookup or date partner or whatever. Hookup's not quite the term I was looking for, the dating partner, for this male student to look at, including one reporting their own attitudes about gender roles or women's roles. Okay, so one possibility is these people might actually these women might fill out the questionnaire about their own views on women's roles in a way that was consistent or inconsistent with the men's views. So what we see here in this graph is the amount of attitude conformity, that is the shift in the woman's views about women's roles towards the man's views. So the women actually had filled out the questionnaire about their view of women's roles before, and then they filled it out again after they viewed the guy. And the graph here shows more change toward the man's views as you go up from 0 to 5. Okay, so the guy who wasn't so cute and not such a good career prospect, you can see that those women did not change their views on women's roles at all after looking at his material and filling out the questionnaire for themselves. On the other hand, the guys who were prepared to interact with the desirable guy adjusted their opinions to match his much more closely. So this appears to show that when women are anticipating interacting with an attractive male, they will express opinions that are more similar to the guys than if they were anticipating interacting with an unattractive male. So these findings indicate that people in general realize that other people tend to like people who are similar to them in their attitudes and beliefs, and they sometimes change their public opinions or their self-presentation of their opinions to get desirable others to like them. So they use opinion conformity as a self-presentational strategy to get other people to like them, to get that goal of appearing likable and or attracting and retaining mates. So lastly, we have our goal of appearing likable as related to projecting modesty. we already found when we were talking about flattery that sometimes flattery can backfire. Modesty is kind of like, well, you want to put your best foot forward, but we also have some norms against appearing too stuck up on yourself, too bold, or too proud of yourself. And so another strategy in self-presentation is to, kind of acknowledge your good points, but to be modest, because people also value or like modesty. But there are some cultural differences in modesty. Compared to European Americans, African Americans are much more tolerant of bragging, kind of expressing pride about their better aspects. And on the other hand, Asian Americans are much more likely to project modesty. So, we have the general value of kind of speaking well of yourself in self-presentation, but we can, in our culture, notice that we can sometimes go too far with that. And then even beyond that, if we look at subcultural differences, we see that African Americans are more tolerant of bragging, so they're not so modest, whereas Asian Americans, as a subculture of our broad culture, are more likely to project modesty as a self-presentational tactic. So we're going to make a kind of a transition here to the goal of appearing competent, self-promotion, because that's kind of the opposite of modesty, but we'll focus more on competency motivations. So we are very interested in having others believe that we're competent, and so sometimes we actually stage performances in order for others to appreciate our competence. So it's almost like going back to that dramaturgical perspective. Even though we're not really putting on a play per se, we do set up situations where people can notice our competency. So in particular, in situations where competency is very important, such as in a classroom or in a job setting, we want people to see us as competent, and so we may seek out opportunities or even create opportunities to demonstrate our competence in public, particularly if we feel like we've been overlooked. So you might set up a situation where your boss would notice you doing a really good job of a particular part of your employment. On the other hand, incompetent people will oftentimes avoid public stagings to evade detection. So you might think about some lazy or incompetent people that you work with. They kind of keep it on a down low. They don't really show themselves very obviously out in front of the boss. But on the other hand, a person who is really wanting to be recognized and will often create opportunities for the boss to notice them. And sometimes we, since we see that kind of ingratiating behavior or self-presentational behavior as being a little bit over the top, we might have certain names for those people who are really sucking up to the boss, right? But the strategy, the self-presentational strategy for them, is to be seen as competent and then appreciated by the boss and help them get towards some desirable goals. We can also claim competence. Rather than demonstrating competence that we hope other people notice, we can also directly claim competence. And claiming competence is appropriate in some social contexts and will be well received in some situations. And then there are other situations that, like flattery, it can backfire. Because again, we have this cultural value on modesty. It's kind of in tension with the cultural value of appearing competent and likable. So some situations where claiming competence directly is quite appropriate or expected are situations where the competence is directly focused on, such as in a job interview. You are expected to put out a resume and speak to that resume about your different types of competencies. It's really helpful when another person can boast or comment on your competence in a secondhand way. So if you get a friend to talk about what a great job you've been doing at work, or if we have letters of recommendation, these kind of second-hand claims of competence are quite helpful. And finally, as I said, we sometimes are concerned about verbal claims of competence because it can interfere with the goal of projecting modesty. And also, there are people who believe that those who are truly competent can demonstrate it through their behavior and don't need to claim it verbally. So that's the end of this particular segment. We'll talk some more about self-presentation in the next lecture. But I will ask you to consider completing that self-monitoring scale. It gives you an indication of how to score that up at the top of that self-monitoring handout. And it does tell you that, at least among Northern American college students, the average score is about 10 or 11 on those different questions when you add them all together as it's instructed there. Kind of the middle point is 10 or 11. So if you have a score that's considerably lower than that, then you're a low self-monitor. If you have a score that's considerably higher than that is 10 or 11, then you're a high self-monitor. And if you're kind of right near 10 or 11, you're kind of in the middle. But it's particularly noteworthy if you're low self-monitor, you might see your behavior is more or less consistent across many situations, and your self-concept is the primary guide for your behavior. On the other hand, if you have a very high self-monitoring score, you might reflect on your own experiences and see that your behavior, you change that up, and you're more likely to try to change your presentation of yourself to fit in with the demands of different situations. Okay, thank you for that. We'll see you for the next lecture. Oops, hang on. I was really worried that I hadn't been recording that